Let me ask you something that most people in your life will tell you it's off limits. Do you believe in God? I'm not asking whether you go to church. I'm not asking you whether you were baptized, confirmed, bar mitzvahed, or raised in a tradition that gave you a framework for the sacred. I'm asking something much more personal and much more honest than that. When you are completely alone, not performing for your family, not managing your social identity, not operating within the institutional frame you inherited when you are leading your team. Do you sense something larger than yourself? Something that the rational mind cannot fully account for? Something that makes the beauty of the world feel like it means something, and that makes suffering feel like it is pointing somewhere? Because if you do, if there is something in you that reaches toward the transcendent, I have some really important news for you. That reaching, that's yours. It always was. It belongs to you, to your consciousness, to the deepest part of your human architecture. It was there before any institution told you what to call it, before any hierarchy told you who the authorized middleman between you and the sacred was, before any organization decided it had the right to monetize, regulate, and in too many cases exploit the most intimate and vulnerable dimension of your humanity. This episode is not an attack on faith. It is an attack on the institutions that took faith, the raw, genuine, beautiful, biologically hardwired human need for the sacred, and built a power structure on top of it, and how it might be impacting your leadership. A power structure that protected abusers behind the seal of confession, that accumulated wealth while preaching poverty, that aligned itself with political power while claiming to represent divine authority, that created a culture of silence, obedience, and shame so total that it crushed the spiritual lives of millions of people who dared to believe that God was something bigger than the institution that claimed to represent it. I'm talking about the Catholic Church. I'm talking about religious institutions. I'm talking about evangelicalism. I'm talking about any religious institution that has allowed the bureaucracy of faith to become the enemy of faith itself. And I'm talking about what all of this, the psychology, the neuroscience, the historical corruption, the institutional cover-up, has to do with how you lead. Because if you think this has nothing to do with your boardroom, you haven't been paying attention to what power does to people when it's not adequately checked. Don't get me wrong, I am a man of faith. I do my prayers every single day during my meditation. This episode is meant to talk about power and what power can do to men. Welcome to the H2H experiment. I am Joao and I am your host. Today we go to the most consequential, most under-examined intersection in the history of human civilization. The intersection of genuine spirituality and institutional corruption. This episode is going to make some people very uncomfortable, and that's good. Discomfort is the beginning of honesty. And if there is any subject in human history where we have been desperately, catastrophically short of honesty, is this one. I hope this episode makes you reflect on the power struggle and the impact that power has on humans. Let's begin with a distinction so fundamental that everything else in this episode depends on it. Religion is not the church. The church is not God. The word God is just a linguistic resource we used to represent something much bigger, which is the faith in an existence that is much superior than our shallow human form. And confusing them has been one of the most expensive mistakes in human history. Religion, in its essential form, is the human attempt to make contact with the sacred, to find meaning in suffering, to experience connection to something beyond the individual self. To ask the questions that science, at its honest edges, still cannot fully answer. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does consciousness exist? What is the moral architecture of the universe? Why do we even exist at all? These are not stupid questions. They are the most important questions, and the neuroscience of religion, the field now called neurotheology, has established beyond any serious dispute that the capacity for spiritual experience is not a delusion or a pathology. It is a feature of the human brain. Prayer activates the dopaminergic reward circuits. Ritual increases serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin release. Dr. Andrew Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania has spent decades documenting this. The architecture of our brains, he concluded, will not allow religion to disappear because it fulfills needs that our biology was designed to have. What is not divine is the institution that decided it owned exclusive access to all of it. The Catholic Church is the largest religious organization on earth, 1.36 billion members, over 2,000 years of history, hospitals, schools, universities, charitable networks that deliver genuine good in the world every single day. It is also the largest documented institutional cover-up of child sexual abuse in human history. Let those two things exist simultaneously in your mind. Let them sink. Because the tragedy of the Catholic Church is that the institution failed precisely because it forgot the difference between its stated mission and its actual operating priorities. This is also extremely relevant for businesses. Let me give you the numbers, not as a rhetorical device, because these numbers represent human beings and they deserve to be said clearly. More than 4,000 priests were accused of sexually abusing children in the United States alone between 1950 and 2002, according to the John Jay College report, based on the church's own data. Between 2004 and 2023, church spent more than $5 billion on sexual abuse cases in the United States alone. In France, an independent commission concluded there were approximately 216,000 victims of clergy sexual abuse between 1950 and 2020. In Ireland, the Ryan Commission found church-run orphanages and industrial schools were places of fear, neglect, and endemic sexual abuse, with nearly 15,000 underage victims between 1970 and 1990 alone. In October 2024, Akija says of Los Angeles agreed to pay $880 million to 1,350 victims, the largest single settlement in church history, bringing the LA total to $1.5 billion. These are not isolated incidents. They are the documented, forensically verified output of an institutional culture that, when forced to choose between protecting children and protecting its own power and reputation, chose its own power. Every single time. Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, who knew priests under his authority were raping children and systematically moved them from parish to parish, was not fired, was not trialed, was not imprisoned. He was transferred to Rome, where he lived out his days as a senior Vatican official, safely beyond the reach of American law. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who sexually abused seminarians and teenagers for decades, was nonetheless promoted to cardinal by Pope John Paul II in 2001, despite rumors so pervasive that multiple church insiders described them as an open secret. This is not a story about a few bad men. This is a story about what institutions do when they have accumulated enough power, enough moral authority, and enough doctrinal immunity from scrutiny that accountability becomes structurally impossible. And the financial dimension makes the moral failure even more grotesque. The Catholic Church has at least $73 billion in documented assets, though its finances are largely secret and the true figure is almost certainly higher. Germany's Catholic dioceses held approximately $33 billion. Australia's Catholic Church holds over $30 billion. The Vatican owns more than 5,000 properties worldwide. Roughly two-thirds of the Holy See's income comes from its own investments and property revenues, not from donations. And yet, the institution that sits on this financial empire asks its most faithful, often its poorest members in developing nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia to donate, to give, to sacrifice materially for the institution, while the institution moves money through a bank that has been implicated in money laundering, tax evasion, and financial scandals so repeatedly that you could teach a graduate seminar on Vatican Bank criminality and never run out of material. This is what the exploitation of faith looks like. Not the dramatic Hollywood version, the organizational version, the real world version, the slow, systematic, bureaucratic version. And it is not just the Catholics. The Southern Baptist Convention was found in 2022 to have concealed a database of over 700 credibly accused sexual abusers for decades, while publicly claiming it had no authority to act. Jehovah's Witnesses operate a two-witness policy that child protection experts have called a perpetrator protection program. Evangelical celebrity pastors have built multi-million-dollar personal brands on faith while engaging in patterns of abuse, financial exploitation, and spiritual manipulation. The pattern is the same every time. Whenever an institution claims divine sanction for its authority, it simultaneously claims immunity from accountability, and that immunity is where the rot begins. Now, let's go inside the brain, because the exploitation of religious faith is not random. It's not opportunistic. It is, in the most disturbing sense, scientifically predictable. Genuine spiritual experience, prayer, ritual, meditation, mystical states, activates some of the brain's most powerful reward circuitry. Religious rituals increase levels of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, the chemicals that make us feel good, want to repeat experiences, and bond deeply with others. Brain imaging studies have shown that prayer activates the caudate nucleus, the same region involved in reward processing and motivation. These are not mere metaphors. They are neurochemical events documented in peer-reviewed research by Dr. Andrew Newberg and others in the field of neurotheology. And here's where it gets complicated, because the same oxytocin system that generates the warmth of genuine spiritual community also generates trust, bonding, the lowering of threat detection, the willingness to believe that the people sharing this experience with you, especially those designated as its authorities, can be trusted with your most valuable self. The confession booth is a neurological masterpiece of institutional control. Think about what it actually is: sensory isolation, absolute moral authority, intimate disclosure, and conditional absolution. The entire architecture is designed to produce psychological dependence on the institutional mediator between you and divine grace. Now, add the concept of hell, of eternal damnation. The human brain responds to existential threat at the same neurological level as the physical danger. The fear of eternal punishment activates the same cortisol-driven, amygdala-fired threat responses as any other mortal danger. And who controls the threat? The institution. Who offers the relief? The institution. Who defines the criteria for salvation? The institution. This is the most sophisticated psychological control system ever constructed, and it has been running at scale across billions of human brains for 2,000 years. The psychiatrist Judith Herman, in her landmark work Trauma and Recovery, identified the conditions most reliably associated with coercive control: isolation from outside information, monopoly on truth, alternating reward and threat, and the production of shame. Now read that list again. Then tell me it doesn't describe the institutional dynamics of the church or any high-control religious organization with clinical precision. Now, there is a distinction that every serious philosopher and theologian in history has understood. and that institutional religion has spent 2 millennia working extremely hard to obscure. The distinction between the sacred and the institution that claims to represent the sacred. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Christian mystic, was investigated by the Inquisition for saying what is obvious to any honest theologian: that the experience of God is direct, that the divine is not mediated through institutional hierarchy, but is accessible immediately and without organizational intermediary to any human consciousness that opens itself to it. The Church called it heresy, because Eckhart's theology, if accepted, made the institutional church structurally unnecessary. Spinoza, excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1656, identified God with nature itself, with the totality of existence, immanent in every particle of reality rather than residing in a supernatural realm accessible only through doctrinal compliance. The institution called it atheism. What it actually was a direct challenge to institutional monopoly on the sacred. Thomas Jefferson cut out the miracle passages from the New Testament and retained only the ethical teaching of Jesus. He understood something institutional Christianity has never been comfortable with, that the moral and spiritual teaching and the supernatural apparatus built around it to generate institutional authority are separable, and that separating them is not sacrilege. It is honesty. The Buddha, we're saying clearly, never founded an institution. He thought a method, a practice of direct investigation of the nature of the mind and suffering. The bureaucracy that accumulated around the teaching, that was man, that was power, that was the inevitable tendency of human institutions to convert a living practice into a controllable organization. The sacred, if it really exists, does not need a bureaucracy. It does not need a hierarchy. It does not need a bank account, a property portfolio, or a team of lawyers. It does not need to threaten people with eternal damnation to maintain their loyalty. It does not need to move child abusers from diocese to diocese to protect its brand. The bureaucracy exists for one reason only, because power, once accumulated, does everything in its institutional capacity to preserve itself, which has a very interesting similarity to the ego. And the most effective way to preserve institutional power is to make that power feel divine, unchallengeable, sacred. This is the most important lie in the history of human civilization, that the institution is the faith, that questioning the hierarchy is questioning God, that the corrupt, self-interested, deeply human organization is the representative of something transcendent. It isn't. It never was. And the people who have built their understanding of the sacred entirely on that lie have, in many cases, lost both. Because when the institution's corruption becomes undeniable, they cannot distinguish between the rotting vessel and the water it was supposed to carry. We have all seen it. Perfect executive, the perfect one. Polished, buttoned up, delivering a sanitized script with the mechanical precision of a news broadcaster. They are technically flawless, and yet, sitting in that audience, you feel absolutely nothing. The corporate world has taught us to hide behind slides, to muffle our heartbeats with tailored suits, and to use jargon as a shield. We were told that executive presence meant being impenetrable. We were told wrong. My new book, Shut Up and Feel, is the definitive antidote to the corporate script. It's not about improving your public speaking. It's about unlearning the performance. It's about the neurobiology of your presence, the architecture of your silence, and the radical courage it takes to be human in a world of robots. Stop trying to survive the stage. Start owning the room. Shut Up and Feel is available now on Amazon. You can find the link right here in the show notes of the episode. Drop the armor. It's time to connect. All right, I would like to focus on the Boston case study. Not because it is the worst, it is because it is the most forensically documented, the most publicly investigated, and because the film Spotlight, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2016, has made the basic facts available to virtually anyone paying attention. In 2002, the Boston Globe published a series of articles revealing not just the sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests in the Boston Archdiocese, but the systematic, deliberate, decades-long institutional cover-up orchestrated by Cardinal Bernard Law and the hierarchy beneath him. The cover-up was not chaotic. It was not panicked. It was organized, methodical, bureaucratic. The church had a system. Transfer the priests, seal the files, pay off the family under non-disclosure agreements, characterize the abuser as a struggling human being in need for compassion rather than a predator who needed to be removed from access to children. The victims, they were managed, minimized, told their faith required silence, told their suffering was a cross to bear, told that the reputation of the Church, of God's institution on earth, was more important than their pain. Think about what kind of organizational culture produces that fucking response. Think about the meetings that must have taken place, the deliberate decision that made by multiple educated, intelligent, morally serious human beings at multiple levels of a global institution that protecting the organization's reputation was worth more than the safety of children. That just blows my mind to think about it. This is not a story about evil. It is a story about what power does to institutions over time, about how the survival of the organization gradually, imperceptibly, becomes the primary value, eclipsing the mission that justified the organization's existence in the first place. The church did not begin as a cover-up machine. It began as a community of people organizing themselves around a profound spiritual and ethical teaching. But over 2,000 years, it accumulated power without adequate external accountability, and produced exactly what power always produces when it is not checked: the belief that the institution is more important than the people it was created to serve. That is not a theological problem. That is a leadership problem, and is one of the most universal leadership problems there is. Now, let me make the bridge that this episode has been building towards, because I'm not here simply to critique institutions. I'm here to use it as the most documented, most extreme, most instructive case study in organizational corruption available to any leader on earth. Let's go through some important points. First, the most dangerous power is the power that claims to be unchallengeable. The church's authority was insulated from challenge by doctrinal design. To question the bishop was to question God. This immunity from challenge is precisely what allowed the abuse to continue for decades. The system had no mechanism for honest feedback to reach the top, if in any form, that could actually change behavior. Ask yourself, what in your organization has been granted the status of unchallengeable? What strategies, cultural norms, what leadership behaviors have accumulated enough institutional authority that no one feels safe questioning them? Because wherever that immunity exists, that is where your version of the cover-up is happening. Second point, the silence of the people around you is not agreement, it is self-preservation. The abuse scandal was not a secret. Countless people in these institutions knew, or suspected, or heard, and they said nothing. Not because they were evil, but because the institutional culture communicated with devastating clarity that the consequences of speaking were worse than the consequences of silence. If the people around you are consistently agreeable, if your meetings are smooth and comfortable and free of genuine challenge, do not interpret it as evidence that everything is fine. Interpreted it as evidence that the cost of honesty in your culture is too high for most people to pay. Third point, when an institution's reputation becomes more important than its people, the mission is already dead. The church made a clear, documented, repeatable choice: protect the brand, manage the victim, transfer the abuser. What is the equivalent in your organization? When did you last make a decision that protected the company's image at the expense of doing the right thing by a person? When did you last manage a situation rather than address it because addressing it felt like it might damage something institutionally valuable? The church's failure did not come from a single catastrophic decision. It came from 1,000 small ones, each one defensible in isolation, each one moving incrementally toward an organizational culture where the cover-up had become the mission. And fourth point, genuine faith in any context cannot be coerced. It can only be invited. The church tried to produce loyalty through fear, through the threat of hell, through shame, through the structural impossibility of honest challenge. And for a very long time it worked. Billions of people complied, but compliance is not faith. And compliance is not engagement. It is the performance of loyalty by people who have been given no safe alternative. You can produce compliance through fear. What you cannot produce is genuine commitment, creative risk, honest feedback, the kind of trust that makes organizations genuinely greater rather than merely functional. The church's greatest failure was replacing genuine spiritual community with coercive compliance. Don't make the same mistake with your people. This is not a theoretical sermon. This is a mirror you must hold up to your own organizational DNA. The Catholic Church's catastrophic failure wasn't just a religious event. It was the ultimate stress test for institutional power. Every single lesson we just covered, the demand for unquestioning obedience, the toxic culture of silence, the institutional defense of the brand at the expense of human beings, these are not unique to a seminary or diocese. They are the universal hallmarks of a corrupting leadership culture, regardless of whether your mission is divine salvation or quarterly profit. The difference is merely one of degree, not of kind. We have analyzed their failure. Now, let's stop observing and start investigating your own organization with the same forensic honesty. That begins with this week's experiment. Alright, in the H2H experiment of this week, we have 3 steps. Deceptively simple, genuinely difficult. Step 1. Write down your organization's stated mission in 1 sentence. Then write down 3 decisions your organization or you personally made in the last 12 months that were primarily in service of institutional self-preservation rather than the mission. Be honest, not the comfortable version, the true one. Step 2. Who in your organization is currently being silenced, not by explicit threat, but by the structural cost of speaking? Who knows something that needs to be heard but has calculated correctly or incorrectly that saying it would cost them more than staying quiet? And what have you done specifically, concretely in the last quarter to make it safe for that person to speak? And step 3. Identify 1 truth in your organization that is currently being managed rather than addressed. 1 problem that everyone knows about, but that has been given the institutional equivalent of a transfer to another diocese. Commit to addressing it, not managing it, addressing it. And that's the whole experiment. 3 steps. The simplicity is deceptive, I know. Because doing it honestly is one of the hardest things a leader can do. And not doing it is how organizations, religious and secular alike, drift from mission to cover up without anyone inside them quite noticing when the transition happened. I want to end this episode with something that might surprise you, given how hard we've gone today. I have enormous respect for faith. I am a faithful person myself. Not for the institutions that have betrayed it, but for the thing itself. The raw, genuine, biologically real, philosophically serious human need to reach toward something larger than the individual self. That need is not pathetic at all. It is not delusional. It is not a sign of mental weakness. It is one of the most distinctly human things there is. The neuroscience confirms it. The philosophy takes it seriously. In the history of the world's greatest ethical teachers, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Spinoza, the mystics of every tradition, suggests that whatever they were pointing at, it was real enough to change civilizations. What those teachers did not do, none of them, in their actual teaching, was build an empire on top of it. The empire came later. The lawyers and the land and the bank accounts and the political alliance and the cover-ups came later. Those were the work of men with the same drives, the same fears, the same hunger for power and safety that characterize every other human institution. The sacred and the corrupt are not the same thing. They never were. And the first act of genuine spiritual intelligence, whether you are a believer or an agnostic or an atheist, is to learn to tell the difference. The second act is to refuse to let your own organization slide from the first into the second, because the slide is always gradual, always incremental, always made up of individually defensible decisions that are, in aggregate, the construction of an organization that has confused its own survival with its reason for existing. The moment any organization believes it is too important to be accountable, it has already lost the only thing that made it worth building. Alright, and this is the end of this episode, but the H2H experiment is not a mere leadership of self-development podcast. We are here to build something much more meaningful, a new philosophy of human-centered leadership built on forensic honesty, accountability, and the courage to challenge institutional rot with the intention of building consciousness. Thank you for listening or watching us today. If this episode challenged you, illuminated something important, or made you uncomfortable in a productive way, or even made you reflect, please subscribe to the H2H experiment on your platform of choice so you don't miss our next investigation. Thank you once again. See you next time. Bye.